welcome to episode 2 of season 4 of Seat Designers. As always, I'm here, Gareth Millward, with my lovely co-host from Denmark, Frederick Olsen.
Hello.
And Trolls Plymouth.
Hello.
Yes, he's a little bit ill. And today we're going to be talking about humour in adventure games with a guest who has already been on this show before. Some of you may remember this.
Okay, and we only have time for one more question, and you're the only person with your hand up. So you've achieved very little there. But what's your question?
Achievement's still unlocked. My question goes to Mr. Cecil. That is how you pronounce your last name, right?
Yes, well done. Well done.
That was not the question.
Thank you.
How could we forget?
We're going to play that clip as many times as possible.
It sounds like we're descending into utter chaos there. I feel bad as the chair. Oh, wait, I'm talking already and I haven't been introduced yet, have I? Sorry.
You, and that voice, that lovely ginger-haired voice, was Alasdair Beckett-King.
Hello.
Who you may well know...
Sorry, I spoke at the same time as you.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. No. After you.
See, and the British are off to a great start on their own.
Oh yes, there's a lot of overlapping apologies, and the Danes are just off in the corner, eating popcorn and just muttering racist things to each other.
Sorry.
See, that's racist.
Well, we have our apologies, and you have your hooga. So at least we've got the
hookah. That sounds like something you would consume marijuana from.
Anyway, Alasdair Beckett-King, who you may well know from the Nelly Cootalot games, amongst other things. How are you doing, Alasdair?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Off to a flying start. So why?
You may ramp down the politeness. We are a rude bunch.
I'm not actually that well. Actually, I fell over and on the 30th of December, and I sprained my wrist. I chipped a bone in it, and I gashed my chin, and I had 2 stitches in A&E. And I don't drink, so I wasn't in the least bit drunk. But the people at Accident and Emergency don't believe you if you do an injury over the New Year's weekend. If you fall over in the ice, they don't believe that you were sober. So
comes Razor.
And I fell over at London Bridge train station, running to catch a Southern Rail train. And someone stepped over me. As soon as I fell, someone stepped over me to get into the station, because that's London. Wow. So take all your stereotypes of British politeness and throw them away. Although I did get back up and get on the train, because Trolls, as you know, Southern Rail trains do not wait for you. So
yes.
At the very least, since it's Southern Rail, you're not exactly bound to be running for one ever again in your life. There'll be plenty of time for you to make it.
That was the last Southern Rail train, but I was on it, bleeding profusely. And a German man gave me a packet of tissues to stop the bleeding. And the brand on the tissues was just "ja," like the German word for yes, just "ja," which was so cheerful. I needed something to cheer me up, and just a packet of "ja" tissues, which was nice.
Well, that's very, very apt, because we'll be talking about humor in adventure games, of course, so yar.
There's just something inherently funny about the only person who will help out this lovely ginger-haired man who's bleeding profusely all over the train seats is a person from a country who once tried to bomb the shit out of you.
That's true, but he knows good train services, and so when which I now realise may have sounded like a Holocaust joke, which I didn't mean it to be. If you could see my face, you would know how much I regret saying that. I just meant that trains are better in Germany.
Yeah, well,
successfully made both jokes at the same time. I applaud you for that.
It's a form of success that I take no pride in. Sorry about that.
Obviously, we have no video, but what you would have seen if we had video on would be Alasdair's Skype avatar is just this white square, but it actually blushed just now. It turned full red.
Actually turned a little shade of hue. A hue shade of also pink. Yeah, that's it. Don't mind me, I'm just here.
So
what are we going to talk about again?
Well, today the plan was, and I don't know how, it's clearly not going to go very well, but the plan was to talk about humour in adventure games and how you inject humour into games and make it work. Because obviously we all know of examples of games that have tried too hard or games that have completely missed the mark, but we also know examples of games that have done it quite well, including ones that Alasdair may or may not have written. So we just wanted to open the floor and see what kind of ideas came into the melting pot.
Yeah, because humour is hard. It's surprisingly hard because most people who don't play a lot of adventure games will, inevitably point to Monkey Island, and they'll have this idea that because LucasArts were, a big thing back in the 90s, comedy and adventure games kind of go together. You kind of expect funny stuff to happen in adventure games. It's not. It wasn't until Sierra Online started making it big with the King's Quest and such. They were the serious ones, and then LucasArts comes in and gets all funny on you. So for a long time we've had this idea that adventure games are meant to be funny, but actually being funny is hard. And we've been kind of spoiled with LucasArts adventure games during our childhood because they were quite good at being funny.
And they still are. I mean, a game like Day of the Tentacle or Sam and Max, I mean, those games are still hilarious.
Yes. Timelessly hilarious, in fact. But I think we can easily point to some examples. Maybe we shouldn't mention them all by name because people did work hard on them and tried to put their best effort into them. It's just a pity that these people weren't very funny, or at least not very good at translating their humor into games. Did I skirt around that?
Yeah, it's funny when you.
It's
Should I just come straight out and set Deponia, or?
Yeah, it's funny when you get ill, you get all kind of respectful and politically correct. This is the last thing the show is about. So fucking Deponia. I've heard.
Yes.
Peggy 18.
Have any of us played Deponia before we go too far in slandering it?
No, but we did read that. We did read that article by John Walker in Rock Paper Shotgun, where he details one of the puzzles in one of the later games where you literally sell off a black person into slavery as a monkey. And I have a
child. I believe.
Black child.
Is it an adult or a child?
See,
I haven't played it either.
What's the fucking distinction? It just makes it worse.
At the very least, we can all agree that is definitely worse than accidentally making a Holocaust joke. I think that's the important thing to emphasize.
Yes.
Morally, that is worse.
But Alasdair, before we started recording, you made the comment or the point, the very apt point that South Park would have gotten away with it, and I think that might be because it sounds wrong to say this, but you kind of expect South Park to push those kind of buttons, and it's become almost accepted. But when you have a German developer making that kind of joke and then badly translate that into English, all of a sudden you get this kind of uncertainty. Are they being fucking serious or what?
Because there's kind of two things at play. I think there, without wanting to get too boring and pretentious, because comedy is. Oh, you said humor is hard and comedy is hard, and that is true. It's weird to talk authoritatively about it because there'll be people who have seen me do stand-up, and there'll be people who have played my game who don't think they're funny. And the weird thing is that those people are right, but the people who think that they're funny are also right. But comedy, unlike other kind of forms of entertainment or art forms, it stops being the thing it is if you don't like it, which doesn't happen with music. If you don't like jazz, it doesn't stop jazz being music, in spite of the best efforts of the musicians to stop it being music. It still is music, whatever. Whether you like it or not, a play is still a play if it's a bad play. But if comedy isn't funny, it isn't comedy. And there's something that makes you really angry about that, which doesn't happen. So if you sit in a comedy club, and especially if everyone else is enjoying it and you don't think it's funny, that is really infuriating because you feel like, I'm not part of the group. What's going on? How dare the arrogance of and you get really het up. And the same thing happens with the games. You sit there thinking, how dare they write this joke? And I'm not talking about offensive, the racially offensive bit in Deponia, but it's just that a bad joke is a kind of offensive, which is weird because someone else will really like whatever that joke is and they won't find it offensive, and so it's kind of hard to authoritatively say what is and isn't funny. I'm really bad at doing puns, I think, but other people are brilliant at puns and really like puns. There are still puns in Nelly Cootalot, they're just not very good. So there isn't. I'm sure there are some people who don't find the LucasArts games funny, although I would argue with them. But I'm sure some people don't think those games or find the Space Quest series funnier than the LucasArts games, which I wouldn't agree with, even though I think they are quite funny.
Thank you. You saved that one right at the end.
Well, I mean, it's a very astute observation, and judging by what you're saying, what we can also kind of conclude from this already at this stage is that presumably it has some bearing what you grew up with. I mean, if you grew up with Day of the Tentacle or Sam and Max, you would probably still find that funny if you did back then, because you have a personal relation with those games, and the comedy drew you in and made you feel part of it. If you didn't find them funny, or it's like hit and miss now, if you get introduced to them later, then maybe you're not going to.
Yeah, and I think it's also sort of where the humour comes from. In the LucasArts games, it often comes from the character and situation, whereas there's, I don't know if I want to use the phrase extra diegetic, but I think in the Sierra games, the humour is often the developer or the writer making a joke directly to you, the player, with sort of a wink, saying, "Oh, you didn't expect to die there? Well, you did. And isn't that funny?" which doesn't really happen in the game. It doesn't happen in the story of the game. It happens to you, the player. So it's sort of a meta game. No, it's not a meta. It's like a meta joke. It's a joke about how the game works.
Mm-hmm. What has Trolls' wife got to do with this?
Oh, God.
I'm sorry, is your wife called Meta?
It's not spelled the same way, but yeah, that's... Well, Fred, come on, don't confuse the English.
Sorry.
That is confusing. But she could have a sitcom called That's Totally Meta or something like that.
Yeah.
just pitching that.
Actually,
her middle name is fictional. Something that I also recall now that we talk about it is, I mean, obviously, I have the same predicament as Trolls. I grew up with English as my second language, and it still is for that matter. But the humor
meta.
of the humor of the
that was random.
It's not the same.
Thank you.
I did, and I will never be a member of The Who. Something that I've noticed over the years is how universal the humor of the LucasArts games was, actually. I mean, it's this Tex Avery Looney Tunes kind of thing, whereas if you're going to appreciate the humor of Scott Murphy, you need to be all there as far as the language is concerned, because it's very, very witty. But if you don't have a grasp of what he's trying to say, it'll also go over your head. Whereas a cat painted as a skunk that scares off people in Day of the Tentacle is quite easy to understand. It's this kind of very physical comedy that's very universal to everyone.
Yeah. You went a quite roundabout way of just saying visual comedy translates better abroad.
I could have said that, but didn't.
I was miming it at the time, but neither of you picked up on it. Never mind.
No, because it's just a white fucking square.
Sorry.
Well,
a white square is a fair description of me as a person. So.
We completely forgot to mention this man's impressive credentials during the introduction. So for those of you who've listened this far and are still wondering who the hell is Alasdair Beckett-King,
sorry, I introduced myself by talking too early, and this is my fault.
No, it's very good. We're already off to a flying start. I just want to remind everyone that you should all go to Steam or wherever you pick up your games and pick up Nelly Cootalot, the Fowl Fleet, which is this adventure game that I have previously described as effortlessly funny, and I will continue to do so, even though he assures me it actually took a lot of effort. And he's also a stand-up comedian, which is why he referred to himself as a stand-up comedian earlier in the show. Thank you. Please carry on.
Because no one could figure that out. Also, Tom Baker's in it, the Fourth Doctor, which really impressed me, as a fan.
Who is not.
Yes. You can't go any earlier. They're all dead.
That's true. Also, I was very pleased to work with Sue Sheridan, who was the voice of Trillian in the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Really, she's in there.
So she plays several of the characters. It's about a year since I released it. I've forgotten all the characters' names. She plays Commodore 64.
Did you turn up in a red swimsuit to do the voice?
Sadly, no.
No.
But it was very nice to work with sort of childhood heroes of mine who are also very funny.
Oh, and for those of you who didn't get that reference, go watch the early 80s BBC Hitchhiker's Guide presentation or TV series or whatever you want to call it. Trillian is depicted in rather an odd way, let's say. For fans of the book, anyway. Where am I going with this? No, I'm just derailing everything.
I don't know. It's like being on a show with Jeff Goldblum. Life will.
Illness is going to my head.
Find a way.
I was going to say, you're not entirely there, are you, Trolls? You're just sort of you're the old man rambling in the corner. I remember Hitchhiker's Guide. Yeah, there's a Doctor Who.
Yeah, old man yells at cloud.
Pardon me for trying to interject some sense and appreciation. I'll just be over here with my pipe and sawing off shotgun yelling at kids.
But actually,
right, and I was wrong.
Mentioning Terry Pratchett, though, and Douglas Adams, they are quite relevant to what we were just saying, because their sense of humour is very wordy, and their sense of humour comes across in the narrative quite a lot of the time. So what I mean is it comes across in the prose. It's the writer speaking directly to the reader, rather than in the telling of the story or in the funny things that the characters say. It's often in the musings and the way it's written. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's obvious that those writers have had a big influence on people who make adventure games. And so I think on the Sierra side of things and many of the other games I play, you can see, there are times when the writer is talking directly to the player and sort of making a joke about games. But I think when people like me who grew up with those games sit down and think, I'm going to write something, it's very easy to be tempted to fill it with sort of fourth wall breaking jokes about, that puzzle didn't really make any sense, did it? And those sorts of things, which were used very sparingly in the games I grew up with, and can be very tiresome, I would say.
Yeah,
because it often feels like an easy way out, doesn't it? I mean, it's almost as if this puzzle is shit, but you're going to put it in there, you're just going to make the player aware it's shit. We've had this discussion on this show before about fourth wall breaking.
And we'll gladly have it again, don't worry.
Absolutely, because that's also a kind of comedy. But I agree completely with your Alasdair. It's a very cheap one.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I never use it in Nelly Cootalot, the Fowl Fleet, but I think I use it as little as I can.
Oh, there are a couple of places where Nelly turns to the camera, as it were, air quotes, and addresses the player directly. But they are, as you say, very sparingly used.
But even now, I suppose I would separate that. Yeah, I do have Nelly address the player, but that's because it's in the convention of games where the character talks all the time, and so she does speak directly to the player. But when I say fourth wall breaking jokes, I mean going further than that, where she actually makes a joke about it being a game. Because I find it a little tiresome when the character goes, well, I suppose I could just use this key, but hey, it's an adventure game, and throws it over a wall and then does something else. I've just made up that example, but there are games where that sort of thing happens. And it's funny, but it isn't actually funny.
This also does say something about suspension of disbelief, I feel, because if you don't have those moments where the character has someone to talk to, even if that someone is you as the player, then they're just wandering around talking to themselves, which is also kind of weird and not very realistic if you're trying to immerse yourself into this universe.
No, I think that the sort of monologuing and soliloquies only work in a cartoon game. I think games where I prefer it when in a naturalistic game, if the character has a sort of internal monologue, like in Broken Sword, the way his observations are all in the past tense because they're recollections. I think that works very well.
Which is it's actually interesting because Broken Sword, as far as I know, is one of the few adventure games where the narrator is actually narrating in the past tense. Usually with Sierra games, it's a very direct, we're present in the moment right now, and you just did this. They're also very second person style.
And then there's Virginia Cabers, who's interesting because by the time she's finished narrating, what you did is so far in the past that you can't remember what you actually did.
It's actually being recorded by archaeological scholars. That's a joke based on a dead woman's slow mode of speaking. I'm here to explain jokes, really. That's my role in this.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, which by the way is one thing you should never do in comedy. If I'm correct, I'm looking at the stand-up comedian in the group now. You should never actually go and explain a joke because once you do, it stops being funny. That's like a rule of thumb, isn't it?
That is one of the big rules. Although, if you say that to Stuart Lee or Daniel Kitson, who are both very popular comedians over here in England, then they might disagree with you because there are types of comedy that involve the deconstruction of humour, and a lot of comedy depends on defying the audience's expectation in some way or another, or defying or meeting their expectation, but in perhaps an unexpected way. And if you're dealing with an audience that are sophisticated and understand jokes, as Stuart Lee is, then he can do jokes which play with the structure of comedy. And that does involve explaining a joke. I bet he can deliberately make a bit boring, and the audience will say, "Oh, what's he doing here? This is clever," and wait for him to do something clever instead of saying, "This is outrageous. I want my money back." Although that does happen sometimes.
I remember well, you obviously probably know him, but Bill Bailey is one of the comedians that actually transcended the British Brexit borders and went as far as Denmark. And he does this brilliant joke where three guys walk into a pub, and then the setup is so familiar that the whole thing unfolds with a tedious inevitability, and that's the joke.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Eddie
also
does
has
a very good joke about Queen Victoria as well, which is just Queen Victoria going into a pub, and then he just describes Victoria's policy towards Ireland in the 1840s, and the entire joke is basically that, and nothing happens. It's very good.
Whose joke is that?
Andy Zaltzman.
Andy Zaltzman. Yeah, that makes sense. And Eddie Izzard had three men went into a pub and completely redecorated. It was wonderful. Which is just an anti-joke like Bill Bailey's, because it's not a joke.
Yes. So if you were going to translate that into a computer game format, deconstructing, I mean, my sense is that, if you'll forgive the generalization, that we haven't actually come very far in the evolution of joke or comedy storytelling in adventure games. We've just gotten really finessed at it, if that's a verb. And I think Nelly Cootalot is very finessed, but steeped primarily in these, comedy traditions of the LucasArts games.
It totally is. It's not groundbreaking either in its interface or its structure or its humor.
But it's just really, really good.
But,
I want to stress that.
But do buy it, everyone. Please, seriously, do buy it. But
You should.
But no, it's in a classic style. I suppose what's the game? This is not because it's not a good game, though. I can't remember now. I've just got a terrible memory. What is the name of the game where there is a narrator telling you the things that you did? The Stanley Parable.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that actually did experiment, and it was quite funny in a sort of surreal way, where if you went against the narrator's expectations, he would get flustered and he would try to move the story back onto the track that he wanted it to, and inevitably fail, and then just restart the story.
Yes, and that was sort of, for me, a successful version of that sort of Pratchett or Douglas Adams-like humour, where it comes directly from the writer to the player, without it being about the story. But it is kind of meta because, it's kind of meta because it's about whether the narrator is actually describing what you're doing. So you're trying to think your way out of the confines of the game, and then the humour comes out of that.
Oh yeah, it's extraordinarily. What you could actually do a whole academic piece on it, because it describes the sort of unspoken link between the player, the protagonist, and the narrator. And we've also had this discussion, kind of skirting around the issue on the show before, of is the narrator or is the player supposed to be an avatar of the protagonist, or what's the narrator's role, and all of this horse shit that is incredibly dull, but I just brought it up anyway.
Well, I think that question of whether you are the player or whether you're not the player, I think that is quite important. And I'm not a big fan of you being the player. I read a quote, and it came from some designer, that the protagonist in a video game ought to be the coolest, most interesting person around all the time, with all the most exciting lifestyles and abilities, because it's about fantasy and about players getting to be that guy. And I sort of think in this situation, it always is a guy. And I totally disagree with that, because the protagonist you can name dozens of films where the protagonist is not the coolest, most together, most capable person. Often protagonists are losers. And I think adventure games are unusual in that they choose losers as their protagonists quite a lot. And that's partly to do with humour, but it's also because you can do different kinds of stories if your main character isn't Geralt of Rivia or someone like that.
And there's a potential for that character to grow like George Stobart in Broken Sword, who starts off like an ordinary American tourist and he gets pulled into this web of mystery. Incidentally, that's also a very funny game, I thought. I played it recently, and it's a great adventure game, and it's this great Indiana Jones, Dan Brown-ish, before Dan Brown story. But I was really taken aback by how funny it is. I would say effortlessly funny again, because it's they're just pulling jokes out of their sleeves basically. Or Dave Cummins is God rest his soul.
Well, I think that's also true of Dave Gilbert's games, and that's what I like about them, that they're not comedy games at all, but they have funny moments in them, just like life has funny moments in it, and it puts it in the area of I don't know, maybe Joss Whedon or something like that, where it's primarily dramatic, but there's a lightness of touch, and there's verbal humour to be found in it.
That's what that's what I dig about the early Space Quests. Get that reference, Andrew? It's what I dig about them. Because there were always dramatic stories, like in the first 3 or 4 ones or so. But then there's all this writing by Scott, which is really cerebral and goes a long way to, well, mostly insult you, but which is all not that obvious. So yeah,
in a sort of comedic parental kind of way. Actually, I would excuse Space Quest 2, being that the major plot involves sending robotic insurance salesmen to drive people mad, which is kind of silly in its own right. But you're right, Space Quest 1 and 3 and definitely 4 has like a serious undertone, like a serious underpinning. Something is actually as does 5, really, if you think about it. And then, comedy stuff happens on top. And I really, Alasdair, I really like the point that you made that, as life does, and you brought up Joss Whedon, who I think does a brilliant job of interjecting humor into what is otherwise a serious setting,
yes.
With Buffy and Serenity and the TV series, Firefly is the name of the TV series. He's really
Serenity killed Wash, which I shall never forgive him for.
Are we going down that road?
And he's laughing, but you can hear he's crying as well.
I'm very sad. Well, I saw the film before I saw the TV series, and I went, that guy died. Oh, that's odd. And then I watched the TV series, and I rewatched the film, and I went, he's dead. I can't believe he's dead. Even though I knew he was going to die. So it's amazing how much of a difference investment in character makes, isn't it?
That was exactly the way I saw that as well, yeah.
But that can actually also make a big difference for comedy, I think. Not just those emotional moments.
No, but I suppose we should put this question because Nelly Cootalot falls flat into the comedy game. It's like a comedy genre. It's comedy first, really, because all the set pieces, all the characters, they're all really funny, and they have it's sort of caricature-like in that they don't have like a deep backstory that you must traverse and learn more about the character development and such. But
Charles, incidentally, I think at this point we do need to ask the question: is Gareth dead?
Is he?
He's tried to talk a number of times. You've talked over him, so he's just sitting back and listening.
Sorry. Okay, should I finish my question and then mic over to Gareth?
No.
No. All right. I was just going to ask, what was the decision behind to make Nelly like a comedy first kind of game instead of a serious story with comedic underpinnings, Joss Whedon style?
That's a good question. I describe it as a cartoon game rather than as a comedy game. Well, I know I will sell it as a comedy game. It is funny. It is funny. Please buy it. It is funny. But
I agree.
It is.
I think it's a cartoon game, and that explains the fact that we have simple characters, simple motivations, and straightforward puzzles and all the rest of it, because it exists in a sort of fun cartoon world. But I think the writing is intelligent and smart enough that it's richer than people expect, at first glance, which I think is nice and rewarding. But have I forgotten the question?
Something about serious games with
so why did I do that? So the Fowl Fleet is a follow-up to a freeware game I made years ago, which is called Nelly Cootalot Spoonbeaks Ahoy, and I'm currently remastering that so that the graphics work on HD monitors now.
Nice.
And because it started out as a hobby, I just and I wasn't doing comedy back then. I wanted an excuse to just sort of sit and write silly jokes, and so it started as escapism for me. So that's why it's so lighthearted, and that's why the premise is so silly, and that's why there isn't a dark driving story pushing everything forwards, unless you consider the kidnapping of birds to be dark, which I think is quite a serious business. Birds.
It is, but they barely show up in the game. I'm going to stop talking now because I really want to hear from the most well-educated man in the room. As far as I know, Alasdair, you may have cured cancer in your spare time. I don't know, but as far as I know,
he does look like Jesus.
Ooh, you had to go there, didn't you?
He doesn't look a thing like Jesus, but he does talk like a gentleman like you imagined when you were young.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
Thank you, Gareth. How well educated are you, Gareth? I'm not competing, I'm just interested.
I'm a historian, so they made me get a PhD for that. But
PhD, that definitely beats whatever I have. I have a public speaking award from the Rotarian Society.
Nice. Yeah.
which landed you a job in comedy. That's good.
That's how it works in this business. It's who you know.
You know what a master's in communications got me? I teach really uninterested people how to use Facebook.
He's referring to me.
Actually, a room full of Rotarians, believe it or not. Anyway, now I desperately want to hear if Gareth has anything to add to the conversation.
Well, one of the things that comedy relies on is timing. And one of the problems that you have with an adventure game is that most of the time you can't control the timing specifically. So one of the things that perhaps makes the LucasArts games work with that kind of general narrative, then sort of these sort of set-piece jokes and funny, witty pieces of dialogue is probably that's the bit that the author can control when you receive that, whereas that's not necessarily the case in terms of the pacing of the game. So a lot of jokes that might rely on the narrative or the timing of things happening, you perhaps can't rely on in a game situation.
That's true. I think in sort of good situation comedy or situational comedy, a lot of the big laughs come when characters are getting themselves into a situation and you're anticipating what's going to happen, and that depends on sort of, in some cases, years of butchering you up as an audience to know that person and to know what they're going to do when they find themselves in this situation, because they don't know that thing that you also know. And you're right, in an adventure game, that kind of humour very rarely, in fact, that kind of drama very rarely arises, perhaps because structuring a game with dramatic irony in that way is kind of difficult, because if you're the player, you can't know something that your player character doesn't know, if you know what I mean. If the player, if you the player know that there's something in the room, then you'll just do something differently because you know that information and you are able to communicate it to the protagonist in a way that you can't in a film or a sitcom.
And there's also the technical aspect of it, where usually if you have a classic LucasArts style adventure game and you have dialogue that's supposed to be funny, and you record all the actors separately and they are unable to play off each other, and the in-game mechanism that controls when the next speech bubble is going to appear and such is controlled by an internal timer. You can't have characters interrupt each other or talk over each other or just have that basic comedic timing that two people on the stage or in a TV show could have.
Yes, and it takes an awful lot of work to make bouncing back and forth work, even moderately well. I think the audience, or at least I do when I play an adventure game, they forgive a little bit of that because they understand that programming it so that two lines overlap, especially since you have to display subtitles, is really difficult. Mm-hmm. Although a few games do it. I think I've seen Telltale overlap dialogue during arguments, I think. Or maybe I've not noticed that they haven't done that. But still, I think they've done that.
I think I've seen Oxenfree. I'm watching a Let's Play of that right now. It's apparently a year old, and it's not a funny game by any stretch because, young kids being possessed by ghosts and also radio dials. But there's an awful lot of dialogue in that, and it sounds either they're just really, really good actors and some really good programmers behind the scenes and such, but all the dialogue flows very naturally and they do sort of interrupt each other and overlap. And whenever you pick a conversation option, the dialogue keeps going underneath. Like the characters are still talking to each other. You just have the dialogue options going at the same time. And when you pick one, either your character interrupts the other people or they, patiently wait for them to finish speaking and then go into it. And each of those scenes where you have to pick a dialogue option must have been really carefully thought out because, my God, there's a lot of them, and they all behave slightly differently. So go play Oxenfree, I guess.
Something that would be
something that would be interesting for developers to toy more with. We've had this discussion on the show before when it was just Joel and me.
That's the theme of this episode. We've had this discussion before, but we're actually we're very glad to have. We're very glad to have you on.
Saying it as well.
Yeah, but I'm ill. You're not.
I can refer to irrelevant earlier discussions if you can. Well, anyway, we talked about it in the scope of voice acting, but not in terms of comedy. I just wanted to say that I agree. I think Loom does this, and I mean, Loom is not that funny. It is in a subtle way. There are some subtle jokes in there, and you do have the advantage in that game of, I would say, clearly having people in one recording session recording the dialogue together. I mean, it flows in the same way, but of course there are other technical limitations. But I mean, I would like to see developers who aspire to do comedy games try to do something like that, which fits more with the situation comedy format in a technical way as well, technologically speaking.
I think that's right. I just played Firewatch recently, and I think that also allows you to sort of break in or not say something, or interrupt someone, even though the conversations are quite they're just two people, aren't they? So it's quite linear. But in that case, the acting is top notch, and the characters are very believable, and so the humour is just sort of the humour of real people's conversations, which I think works very well.
Right, because that's something you can't ordinarily do in games, isn't it? It all invariably becomes a bit stilted. I mean, people are very good at doing voice acting these days, but certainly going back to like Space Quest 4 or something, it kind of falls apart. Well, King's Quest 5 is not funny in the slightest. It tries to make some jokes, but those jokes are desperately unfunny. But even Sierra games of yore that try to be funny kind of fall apart because of the voices from time to time.
Well, it feels weird to say this because I know some people have played my game and don't think it's funny, and I know some people played it and didn't like the voice acting, even though lots of the reviewers did like both of those things. So please buy it.
You're good at this.
But I don't want to claim that I did everything right and that it was always perfect or anything. But I've noticed that the lines in Nelly Cootalot are shorter than the lines in lots of other similar indie adventure games, to the tune of being sort of a third as long. And I think that's because there are jokes, because players read faster than voice actors speak. And so if you have a whole paragraph of text with a funny line at the end of it, the player will have read that before the voice actor gets to it, and that ruins the joke.
That's a very good point.
So in Nelly's case, in some games you'll play, there'll be 3 sentences within one recorded line of dialogue, which may be convenient for voice editing purposes and for scripting, but it isn't as good as not revealing the third of those sentences until they're actually said. I'm sure that I've seen games deal with it in a much more sophisticated way, but I do think sort of concealing where a line is going matters when it comes to comedy.
That's a good point, and it's also a very good point to keep things concise. That was one thing that Dave Gilbert brought up at some point during one of either it was on my podcast or the interview that we did. But he really does condense dialogue a lot, and when he's just producing a game or publishing a game, he goes in there and basically takes scissors to the dialogue, because I think in the back of his head, the ghost of Ragnar Tornquist, the guy who wrote The Longest Journey, is haunting him with his 15-minute unskippable cutscenes of pages and pages of dialogue. And on the screen are just 2 people facing each other in a dark room.
I love Ragnar Tornquist with all of my heart and soul, but blimey, there's a lot of dialogue in his games, isn't there? I mean, there is a lot of dialogue in those. I just finished Dreamfall Chapters, which was lovely, but it has a lot of dialogue in it.
Now, kind of on this subject, I would also argue that it's funnier to do this kind of rapid-fire back and forth comedy. I mean, certainly I fall victim to doing that whenever I'm doing games writing. You wouldn't know because a game I worked on had a 30-minute long intro, but otherwise.
Oh, dear God. And it took 10 years out of his life. I think he's still traumatized. It was funny, though. I will grant you that. Probably the bits you didn't write.
But that goes back to...
Yeah, lots of those disappeared over the years.
But that goes back to the idea of humour being a sort of... it is a device to bring people together, but it's also a device to separate yourself from other people. And if you're doing jokes that require you to be on board with the developer by doing a meta joke, or you end up with jokes that require you to sit through loads and loads of dialogue to get to the payoff, you're automatically, almost deliberately alienating large sections of the audience, which might make the joke funnier for the people that are willing to stick around for it, but you're going to alienate so many people in the meantime that people are going to actively hate what you're doing, and that can't be a good idea.
Well, I just played Undertale, and I think Undertale does just what you described, but in quite an extremely successful way, I should say. For instance, in Undertale, you can buy, which I assume you're all familiar with.
Yes, I love it to bits.
Yeah, it's great. At one point, one of the food items you can buy to replenish your health is a pot noodle or something like a non-branded instant noodles. And if you make the instant noodles, it makes you wait for ages in the middle of the fight while you cook the instant noodles, like it would take if you were making real noodles. And just says, oh, they're boiling, still boiling. They're cooking now. And it just goes on for ages. But the joke isn't this annoying? The joke is at your expense, and it is the developer making a joke at your expense. And it's full of jokes like that, but that's because Undertale is a game which plays, like the Stanley Parable, it plays with your expectations about how games ought to work. And so a lot of the jokes are on you as the player. But you feel kind of special to have found them in some cases.
Yeah, there's a lot of secrets hiding in Undertale, and a lot of the jokes come from, just things that you would normally consider glitches. I think there's there's an enemy that pops up that's like a dog, basically just an anthropomorphic dog, and if you pet the dog, his neck just kind of extends a little bit, and if you keep petting him, the head doesn't reset. It just keeps going up and eventually through the screen. And if you keep petting him still, then the head comes down the screen, like on the other side of the screen, and starts coming down again. And it's not even a joke. It's haha, look at the glitch. But actually, it's intentional, or he just kept it in. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Where people like it when things go wrong. So, but not in games. So maybe if you take a glitch and you make it worse like that, take something that doesn't work and make it work even less well, make it even more worse. I mean, that's kind of fun.
That's basically the premise to Goat Simulator, isn't it?
Yeah,
pretty much, yeah.
It is, which is a very funny name for a game.
And I think lots of people are using Gary's mod of Half-Life 2 for comedy purposes as well. I'm thinking back to the stump joke from Monkey Island 1, of course, which took something that looked like a bug and toyed with it.
Yeah, people are still looking for that. What is it, disc 47 or something?
Yes. And I think in another scene of Monkey Island 1, there's a thing in the chef's room, and it's called Thing or question mark, and Guybrush can't work out what it is, and because you can't tell what it is, and obviously the artist's drawn it and nobody knows what it is, so they've just written a series of lines about a thing that nobody knows what it is, which is a meta joke. But when you realise that that's the joke, that that whoever's writing this doesn't know what that thing is supposed to be, you feel, I've worked out the meta joke, and that's kind of, it's not necessarily huge belly laugh funny, but it is nice.
It is.
So that's the kind of subtly fourth wall breaking joke that I would give.
And you know they would have had fun writing it. We did have one of those on VSB as well, where we had one item that we had no idea what it was, and that worked its way in there. Now we're just rattling off things that we actually think are funny, but I have to throw this one in. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy text adventure that Douglas Adams worked on also has this inventory item that keeps popping up, a piece of pocket fluff, and you can't get rid of it. You can drop it in every room that you visit in the game, but it'll still come back, after a spell, and he'll still comment on, you wish you could get rid of it, and you don't actually use it for anything in the game, as far as I remember. It sticks with you until the very end of the game, and I think the end credits bit, the text wall that pops up at the end, you've solved the game. Too bad you never got rid of that pocket fluff. It's like baiting you, like going, you can do it if you want, but it won't actually let you. Well, I mean, that's also funny because it kind of takes something from real life, doesn't it? I mean, that happens to, maybe not with pocket lint or fluff, but like a piece of sticky tape that won't come off your hands or something. We've all had that happen.
So basically what's going to happen after the show is Fred gets in the shower and starts scrubbing his hand. Why won't this piece of sticky tape come off? He's had it for 20 years
like a sellotape Macbeth.
That was kind of meant to be a subtle question. How the fuck do I get this piece of tape off?
Okay, can I ask a serious question?
Yeah.
Just for the hell of it, because we were talking about Deponia earlier, that none of us have played, but intensely dislike.
Because it's prejudiced. That's why we don't like it, because we've been told that it's prejudiced.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say,
John. So I don't need to check. I'm just going to assume it is.
Hashtag nationalism.
But it bears a question that I've been trying to work out on my own, actually. It is, well, basically the question is, why do people find it funny when awful things happen to good people? It's not so much related to Deponia per se, but it is this, having a laugh at other people's expense. I'll give you an example. I fucking hate hidden camera shows, where you play a prank on someone. Actually, I just fucking hate pranks, basically. Like when you're tipping someone's chair over while they're not looking, or, tossing flour in their hair, and I mean the white noodly bit. And why do people find this funny? And I've seen games that try to you walk up to an NPC and you basically ruin their life. And me as a player is supposed to find it funny that you've just ruined someone's life, like set fire to his whole building just to retrieve one single little inventory item. Why is that funny? I'm looking at the entire room here. Go.
Well, I don't think it is very funny, but laughing at people's misfortune is a big part of humour, and laughing at people who aren't you or don't belong to the same group as you is a very traditional and not particularly pleasant side of humour. Some of the theories of where humour comes from is it's sort of one of the theories is that it comes from an anticipation of threat, which is very quickly diminished. Which is why, a scary guy coming towards you, but then he slips over and falls on his bottom. Oh, that's funny, because I thought that he was going to be scary towards me, but now I realise he's an idiot and he's fallen over. It's the relief of realising that the thing that I thought was going to happen isn't going to happen. I think that's one of the anthropological theories for where it sort of comes from, as it's a reaction to relief. And surprise is a part of it. I mentioned that surprise is a big part of quite a lot of jokes. And
I guess there's also this kind of primeval jealousy to it. I mean, it's very funny to watch, like, say, John Cleese as a serious bureaucrat be completely torn apart by Michael Palin. There is something funny about this very serious man who I guess in some ways could be considered a threat to you, but it may also be because you envy him and what he represents, or just instantly hate him. There is something funny about that.
Is that which film is that?
Well, there is one particular Monty Python sketch. I think he's in a post office, and he's playing the same guy who's in the cheese shop sketch and the parrot sketch, the guy with the raincoat.
I can't remember his name, but he has got a name.
He does have a name, and he crops up in a couple of sketches, and he always gets ripped a new one just because of the circumstances, and it's always hilarious, and he's always very deadpan and serious about it.
Interesting that you should bring up Monty Python, because we were talking about the evolution of humor and comedy in games, and just this weekend I was on the other podcast that I do with Robert Menace, Nerd Against the Machine, and he brought up...
This is not relevant to our show, trolls.
Yes, it is. Yes, the relevance is coming. I just wanted to plug something. Alasdair can't be the only one who plugs shit on the show.
I think it's outrageous that you would plug that while Nelly Cootalot is available to buy now on Steam.
Nelly Cootalot.
as well as the Humble Store. Anyway, carry on.
True. I'm sorry to cause offense. He brought up the 7th level games based on the Monty Python license. They did the Holy Grail, and they did what's it called, Meaning of Life.
Yeah, I think it was called. It was kind of like this Activity Suite kind of thing.
There's also that the complete waste of time. Yes, and the humor in those games, and I hesitate to even call it humor, it's basically just you get a screen of something, and there's a couple of hotspots around, and you click on it, and then something inevitably surreal happens in quite Monty Python fashion, but it just never really connects, because you just click on something, and then something surreal happens. And I've actually noticed when watching the old Monty Python TV show, even the audience laugh track is sort of unsure if something funny just happened during, especially the Terry Gilliam animation sketches. But when you're doing it, trying to...
I assume in the case of the Gilliam sketches that the voices of the laugh track has been put in afterwards, because based on the way they produce it. So I don't think there's no real audience laughing at those.
Yeah, but what you're saying, Trolls, is very true, and it's been noted before by some reviewers. If you watch the very first episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus, it's very, very obvious that the audience is quite uncertain about where to laugh and what to expect.
Mm. And if you're actively in a game trying to, elicit a funny response, or if you just want to get to the end, it just becomes an obstacle. This is what I mean by, the evolution of comedy. They try to go in a different route that just is like antithetical to computer game enjoyment somehow.
Well, there's that horrible word, isn't there, Pythonesque, which means in general that it won't be funny because it's in the style of Python. And anyone can do something in the style of Python. You just do things that seem random or borrow from surrealism, full of undergraduate references to books, and then you've done something Pythonesque, which is entirely a crime. It's a terrible thing that the word Pythonesque conjures that up in our minds, and we go, "Oh no, it's going to be Pythonesque. Well, I'll stay away." But that's because it's very easy to imitate the things that Python do on the surface, and very hard to be as funny as that. I mean, most of the sketches that John Cleese and Graham Chapman wrote are basically just synonyms. The sketch is just two people. One person will say something, another person will say another thing, and then they will say exactly those things in a series of increasingly convoluted ways for the rest of the sketch. And so
Intercourse the penguin.
Yeah, exactly. And now there's nothing funny about that structure. Any of us could sit down and write something that follows that structure and it not be funny. And I'm not particularly. I've never been happy with the phrase surreal comedy because I don't think it really describes it. I remember at university watching Chien Andalou, the Buñuel and Dali film. And it's interesting to watch that with an audience of people who don't know what's coming, because for the first sort of 3 minutes, people sort of laugh because it's just full of incomprehensible dream logic non sequiturs, and so this thing happens, and it's like watching Monty Python for about 3 minutes.
The first one, Chien Andalou, I think it's called.
Yes.
Or is it one of the latter ones?
That's the one. Sorry, did I forget to say the title? Yes, what is it that is? The Forgotten Dog. I don't know what I forgot.
The Andalusian Dog, which makes absolutely no sense.
Has no meaning.
There it is.
But after about 3 minutes, any sort of reference to the real world or the expectations that you, the viewer, have broken down completely, and so nothing is funny anymore. So any one of those things might be funny in isolation, in contrast with reality, but in contrast with one another, it stops being funny completely and is genuinely surreal. And Python occasionally drifts towards the genuinely surreal, and that is when it's least funny. I don't know if you will have seen this British film from the 60s called If, Lindsay Anderson's If.
Sorry, no.
Afraid not.
Gareth, you lived in the UK.
I've lived in the UK for 31 years. No, I've never seen it.
No, well, I'd strongly recommend it.
Best bet.
I'm about to spoil one of the best jokes in it. It is a comedy, but it is largely straight. And there's a scene in which it's set at a very posh boys' school, which is extremely oppressive. At one point, the main character, played by Malcolm McDowell, is forced to apologise to the chaplain of the school, who he has offended in some way, and the headmaster says, "You're going to have to apologise to him." He says, "Okay," and the headmaster pulls out a huge drawer in his study, and the chaplain is in the drawer, and he just apologises to him, and then he pushes the drawer back in, and that is the first joke in the film, and comes in about an hour and 15 minutes into the film, and that is the first time anything like that happens in the whole film, and it's a hilarious moment. Because it's a surreal moment in an otherwise largely, I don't want to say naturalistic. It's an art house film and drifts between different styles. But that's kind of how farce works, though, isn't it? I mean, you start off with something that that could happen, and now it's getting more and more stupid until the final scene of a farce is going to be out of context, just completely and utterly bizarre. But if it's done well, then it's a logical conclusion of all the stupid stuff that's happened beforehand. Dr. Strangelove also works like that.
Yes.
You could mistake it for a straight war film for the first 45 minutes, apart from the fact that they overuse the word personally for no apparent reason. And then by increments, things get more and more ridiculous and do reach sort of surreal heights. But I don't think it's. I think you would say the same about the Mighty Boosh. I don't know if you. Yes. The Mighty Boosh. People will always call it surreal, but if there wasn't sort of a mundane undercutting to the things that the hijinks they get up to, I think it would stop being funny, and I think sometimes it does stop being funny, and it does. That's just a series of wacky things.
It's actually interesting that you brought up.
That's also what I kind of think Space Quest does well, because you're just a janitor. It's like there's always this serious or mundane underpinning to a Marx Brothers film, or what have you.
And I actually think it's interesting you brought up Mighty Boosh, because when you described the chaplain in the drawer thing, it immediately brought to mind the scene in Mighty Boosh where one of the characters is feeling really down, and the other one goes, "Well, maybe you'd like to meet Gary Newman," and he just opens up the cupboard door. Gary Newman's in there going, "Hi," and not right now, Gary. And then he just starts sulking again.
And they close the door.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Perhaps they were wittingly or unwittingly plagiarizing Lindsay Anderson there. But yeah, but it is that is probably the least unusual thing that happens in that episode of The Mighty Boosh. But I do think that, for something to be funny, it has to... Because you could, if you were being incredibly tedious about it, as I am now, you could break down Monty Python sketches into being a crazy person is in an ordinary environment, or an ordinary person is in a crazy environment.
Interesting. That's true.
Most of the sketches are one of those two things. There are very few sketches which are a crazy person in a crazy environment.
I don't think you're tedious, but I do think it's a while. It's been a while since you mentioned a certain game that people may want to purchase.
Thank you. Well, I think the other big thing that I think you mentioned in passing earlier on was why it is that humour doesn't translate, and the questions about the universality of humour, and the fact that it is. In video games, it tends to be focused on the language, and that's because animation is really expensive. And really great slapstick takes a long time to do, and you can't be well, maybe you can, but it's hard to pack your game with really high quality, hilarious animation all the time.
And the timing is also difficult in that case. I mean, maybe not so much now where you can, easily, and most computers get to 60 frames per second, but back in ye olden days, you had to choose a bit more carefully what you could show.
But there's also there's also this, and at the fear of sounding racist, there's different countries. Well, I'm Danish, so it comes naturally. There is also different countries have different types of humor, and I say this in a very broad generalizing way, and I know how that sounds. But one of the reasons
there's no reason to assume that you're talking about the Germans, so carry on.
I actually was going to get to that because Deponia is a German game.
Which none of us have played.
Well, maybe a better reference point then is Charlie Hebdo, where a lot of the cartoons that they were accused by a lot of people in this country of racism, especially when there was that one where during the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, there were these black people at the bottom of the sea that looked like monkeys, and anti-racism campaigners in France were adamant that it wasn't racist, that they were satirising the racists. But a lot of people in a lot of other European countries said, no, you're just being racist. And I think both were right. I think it was racist and sending up the racists. And it was a very nuanced position that because it was something as polarising as racial politics meant that you either got the joke and thought it was funny and were willing to defend it to the death, or you didn't get where it was coming from and just thought it was racist. And I mean, I'm a filthy white liberal, so I think it's somewhere in between, and there's no such thing as truth. But there's
the academia coming in.
Yeah,
well, as a cultural Marxist, I would be forced to agree with you.
High five.
No, but that's.
I would do a high five, but that would be cultural appropriation of traditionally.
You need to play the CSI clip now.
No,
but. Just to draw the spotlight back on the English. One of my favorite TV shows is Red Dwarf, and Red Dwarf's humor comes primarily from this division of class where we've got this uptight dick who is constantly perturbed by his lower class kind of sloppy counterpart.
Yes.
And at least for the first couple of seasons anyway, and then they just sort of drift into sci-fi territory.
And that's pretentious. That's the other thing that works about him, is that he's not actually from a higher class, but he wants to be, and he keeps failing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, Rimmer is not that dissimilar from Hyacinth Bucket.
Yes.
They're cut of the same cloth.
The lower middle class social, or maybe Rimmer has the feel of having been publicly schooled, but at a not particularly high class public school. Yeah, so that's what's really good about him, and that's why we properly loathe him over here, because he wants to be posh, which is the worst thing. That's the lowest of the low, social climbing middle class.
Yeah, he wants to be on the pig fucking rung, but he's not quite there yet.
And class is a huge part of British society and the British mentality and British humour, certainly. But I think... Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting that Nelly Cootalot somehow managed to skirt completely around that. Pick it up on Steam, it's very good.
Well, I don't know, because Nelly's got a northern accent, and I think she's extremely disrespectful to anybody. Her main character trait is being disrespectful towards people in positions of authority. I know it's in character, but she's consistently rude and sarcastic and ironic when she's talking to idiots who are actually in charge in the game. I'm not saying it's a revolutionary piece of political satire, but there is...
No, the toff races are going to bring down the social order.
Well, I somehow managed to forget the tough races, which is right at the start of the fucking game. But yeah.
So I would have brought it up if I'd remembered. Yeah, so there's a French aristocrat there, so I lay into the French a little bit as well.
So I mean, awful things happening to awful people, if in your view, awful people. It's generally okay, I would say. I mean, we've been at this subject before where trolls mentioned that awful things happening to good people generally is not funny, and I think that's why Charlie Hebdo was so controversial, because they made fun of a 3-year-old who drowned on the beaches of where was that, Greece, I believe. And whenever there's oh, sorry?
I thought it was a Turkish beach, but I may have been...
Yeah. Well, in that vicinity during the crisis, definitely. And
screw the child. It's the geography we must be.
I'm with... Sorry, yes, I may have missed the point there. But I think I'm with... I think I feel similarly to Gareth. I think if you look at the page of cartoons that particular cartoon was on, it places it in a context that when it was shared out of context on social media, it lacked. And the satirical, the satirical poignard was clearly aimed at the hypocrisy of EU countries in their treatment of refugees, rather than isn't it funny when bad things happen to migrants?
I would argue that good jokes of this variety also in games goes some way to portray the character that bad shit is happening to as largely unsympathetic. I'll give you a good example. In Monkey Island 2, you assume the position of the chef in the inn, and you do so after putting a rat down
basically
the soup
ruining his life.
Yeah, but he actually, if you go into the kitchen before you're supposed to, and he, escorts you out of there, he's kind of an asshole. So I kind of get why that scene was put in there. He's not a very sympathetic character in that moment. He could politely say, I don't think you should be in here. Instead, he's yelling at you and being a dick about it, and so you feel like punishing him.
It's kind of like it's the crime does not befit the punishment or whatever, because it would kind of be like me going into a post office and be treated rudely by the person behind the counter, because they're always rude in post offices for some reason. Then sneak a ticking clock into a package that I want delivered and then point at her and shout terrorist and watch her be carted off by giant men with shotguns and go, ha ha, you will now spend the rest of your life in Guantanamo Bay. Have fun, fucker, because you were rude to me.
That's really the advantage of having a class system.
It's not really the same thing as a rodent in soup in the 16th century.
His career is ruined.
Sorry. The advantage of the class system or character types is that we can establish with a few lines that someone is a horrible person by simply saying, oh, they're one of those sort of people, and therefore we don't mind this bad thing happening to them.
Yes, we first encountered this character reading the Daily Telegraph. Everything from now on is fine.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think a lot of drama and comedy. If you look at any Coen Brothers film, most of them involve someone making a small mistake and then being punished vastly out of proportion with what they actually did. And a lot of tragedy and comedy works like that. So the punishment being vastly out of proportion with the crime is a common characteristic in comedy.
There's actually something we've skirted around, I feel, but we haven't said it outright, which is the old theory that exaggeration promotes understanding. Would you say that this is true, with this particular discussion in mind?
Yeah, I mean, sort of hyperbole and escalation. That's sort of what the Cleese and Chapman sketches are about. It is... sorry, I'm getting a warning.
No, it's not a warning. It's just a polite chat to Gareth, who is the host and supposed to be moderating this, but is not very good at it. Sorry.
Well, you took control you took control very fast, despite being deadly ill.
Sorry. It's not as if thing I was saying.
It's not as if botulism ruins your radio announcer personality.
Undiagnosed botulism.
Well,
actually,
as my recorder has just now told me that we've been going for about an hour, I was going to say
Oh.
This has been a brilliant discussion, and as we're winding down towards the end, I wonder if Alasdair had any words of wisdom or any specific burning issues that he wanted to cover.
Or products to sell.
Well, I think I've been clear about the products. I think the last thing that we should have acknowledged is that the structure of different languages makes comedy work differently in different languages. And this issue came up when translating Nellie, because I think we translated into German, French, Spanish, and Italian. And in fact, Stuart Lee, who I mentioned before, wrote an article many years ago, I think, about the fact that the Germans do have a sense of humour, but their grammatical structure is different than ours, and so we don't recognise their jokes as being jokes in England. Because one of the main rules of writing jokes in English is that you save the funniest word for the end of the sentence. And there's loads of blogs after blogs theorizing about what the funniest kinds of words are, or, if the letter K is funny, and so you've got to try and use a word, try and choose a word that has a K, and all these sorts of slightly voodoo-ish ways of trying to make something funny. Put the funny word at the end. But it is about surprise. Save the thing that you want people to realize last until the end of the sentence. The trouble is that in German, you can't do that, because it's ungrammatical most of the time to put the funny word at the end of the sentence. You can't get the noun at the end of the sentence most of the time. And that's very tough. And so that means the German sense of humour is often drier, and it's more ironic, and some might argue more sophisticated than the British sense of humour, which is about putting jam at the end of a sentence so that everyone goes, "Oh, there was jam in that sentence. I didn't know that was coming."
Most of the Germans I know are hilarious. I just love that kind of dry sense of humour. You tend to get it in the West Midlands as well. That very dry kind of anti-humour of just very Yeah.
Actually,
I've never met a German with a bad sense of humour, but but it is true that the serious sort of mien and demeanour that German society has is misinterpreted by British people as being humorless, and I think it is entirely a misapprehension. But yeah, it is interesting. In lots of cases in translating Nellie, we had to do a different joke in German to what we did in English because it wouldn't work. It wasn't not just was it not funny anymore. It just didn't. It wasn't a joke. They would say, "Well, what does this word mean?" I say, "It's kind of a made-up word that just sounds funny." And they say, "Okay, well, how do we translate?" You can't. You just have to write something new. Or sort of things like half jokes where I just used a word slightly inappropriately, and so it's amusing but not actually laugh out loud funny. Well, how do you translate that? And you sort of can't. And so a lot of the time I would come up with an idea for what, I would write a different joke in English that was non-language based, and then we would translate that into joke, or have to work back and forth. But that was kind of interesting.
Actually, one thing that really impressed me about Nelly Cootalot and the writing in particular was that it had the level of sophistication. And I've brought this up on social media before, and I kind of get the sense that you're a little embarrassed by it. And if you are, excuse me for repeating it, but it's one of the only games, in fact, the only game I can think of that has a menstruation joke in it that's not only subtle but also very funny as well. And I think
what are you saying on social media, and I don't know what joke you're referring to. It's so subtle that I might not have actually intended to write it, so I don't know.
Ouch.
At one point, Nelly says something about, when the red moon is upon me, or something like that.
And I was not remember that at all. I genuinely don't remember that. There are two jokes like that, which are there are jokes like that which were intentional. I genuinely. Oh yeah, I think she says when the red mist descends. I think it's just a standard British figure of speech, I'm afraid, rather than I apologize.
Well, on that bobsled.
Yes, on that bobsled, we probably ought to call this a day. Alasdair, do you have a game at all that you've made that you want to plug?
Well, yes. If you have a moment, please consider purchasing.
Sure.
I would also like to plug a game that I'm working on the English script for, which is a game called Unforeseen Incidents, which Application Systems Heidelberg, who published Nellie, are also publishing, but it's made by Backwoods Entertainment, and it is a mystery thriller rather than a comedy game. And I'm just working on making the English script in English. I
have a postcard of that hanging on my fridge, actually.
Yes, it's got some absolutely lovely artwork, and hopefully it will also have some lovely English lines of dialogue.
Oh, brilliant. Am I back? Sorry, Skype just crashed on me.
Oh, you have perfect timing.
Great, thank you. Sorry.
Yes, no, that's
just
it.
Going into panic mode.
So where can people find you on the internet, Alasdair?
You can find Nelly Cootalot at www.nellycootalot. The problem with Nelly Cootalot is that nobody can spell, pronounce, or remember the name. NELLICCOOTALOT, nellycootalot.com or beckettking.com.
I was about to interrupt you and say that you needn't do that. We'll put a link in the blog post which people can click on. So, we're not...
Please edit my manual Earls out.
Nobody reads
make
the
him
blog.
say them letter by letter.
And please do say the letter W again, because your accent is amazing.
W.
Thank you.
W, is it?
No.
I haven't got an amazing accent, have I?
There seems to be something exotic about English accents. I mean, I'm from Birmingham, so I don't know.
Well, to a person who doesn't actually speak English and who somehow picked up this random, generic sort of American-sounding but not quite accent, it's really endearing, and I love it to bits. And that was my weird moment of the day. Thank you.
Yeah. Now you had a couple of those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. True.
Well, that's been this episode. We need to get trolls to bed. So say goodbye, Fred.
Goodbye.
Say goodbye, trolls.
Goodbye. Don't forget the ending spiel.
Oh, yes, the ending spiel, yes. You know all of this anyway. Go on to our website, backseatdesigners.com. There you'll find all the links of everything that we've talked about, so that Alasdair doesn't have to repeat himself. We'll also put up details of social media and things like that. You can follow us at BS Designers on the Twitters. We're also on the Facebooks, so search for Backseat Designers. It's all very, very logical. And we'll be back next week. When do we release these now? Sunday evening? Sunday morning?
Sunday's thing. Oh, and there's also Frederick's drug fund.
Oh, yes. If you could see your way to making sure that Fred is kept up with coke and hookers, please go to the Patreon page for Backseat Designers, where you can donate as much coke or money for coke as you like. Alasdair, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for...
Yes, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and we will see you all next week.
No more for today.